Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. We are coming to you live from the New Black Wall Street Market, New Black Wall Street Radio, and we have a very special podcast that we're starting off today, Policing from a Black Man's Perspective. I'm gonna let that sink in for just a quick second. Policing from a Black Man's Perspective. We are joined by two retired police officers that happen to be Black men who want to share their experiences and share what it's like to police from a Black man's perspective. And I'm going to have them introduce yourselves. Can you introduce yourselves, please, gentlemen?
Yeah, my name is Charles Yarbrough. Retired D.C. police officer. I did 36 years with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. I started out from the police academy. I was a native Washingtonian. Once I graduated from the police academy, I was assigned to what they call the 1st District, which is downtown in Washington, D.C. From there, I was in patrol for 3.5 years. From there, I went to our Special Operations Division. At the time, it was called the Special Tactics Branch. And we developed a SWAT team back in 1984. I stayed there for 6.5 years as a tactical operator. Got promoted to the rank of sergeant, left and went to the 2nd District, which is up in Georgetown. I stayed there in patrol. From there, I went to our Communications Division. I didn't like that because I didn't like being confined. From there, I went to the police academy from 1990 until the year 2000. As a sergeant, I was in charge of the physical skills section, which consists of physical training for recruit officers, in-service training, defensive tactics, firearms training, and so forth. I left there, went back to the SWAT team in 2000 as a team leader and training coordinator from 2000 until I retired in 2012. I retired in 2012. That's when I retired for the first time. Went overseas with the State Department as a private contractor. I've been to Africa twice, been to Jordan 4 times, and been to Afghanistan. I came back to the United States and worked at the IMF downtown. Then I left there and got rehired back to the DC Police Department as a senior sergeant in 2016 until I retired again to the 2nd time in 2021. I worked at the Tactical Training Center, which consists of training for in-service training, use of force, and also with the active shooter. I retired again in 2021, and currently living now in Atlanta, Georgia, and retired with my wife and 6 grandchildren.
Awesome. Great.
My name is Craig Howard. I did 28 years in law enforcement. My first 2 years was with the City of Atlanta Police Department from 87 to 89. In 1989, I moved to Maryland and went to work for the Prince George's County Police Department. I retired there in 2016 as the Assistant Chief of Police. During my career, I worked as a patrol officer. I worked with robbery squad. I worked homicide. I worked internal affairs. I was a district commander. Had an opportunity to work abroad down in Colombia, South America. Went down with the DEA with a couple of chiefs from the state of Maryland. Pretty much anything to do with investigations and law enforcement. The only unit I didn't work as an investigator was in narcotics. So between Atlanta and Prince George's County, I think I had a pretty well-rounded career. I'm a graduate of the Police Executive Research Forum, and I'm also a graduate of the FBI National Executive Institute. So that pretty much sums my career.
Wow, both of you guys have extremely impressive resumes. So if anybody out there want to doubt that these brothers don't know what they're talking about, go ahead and get that out your brain right now, because they know their stuff. And they're here to share some really good things with us. And where we're going to start with this conversation is we're going to talk about the history of Black policing. And we can even go back to whoever you recall as the first Black lawman, and then we can kind of come forward from there. And we'll end up actually in I'm going to kind of leave it open into where we end up, because this conversation is going to be so chock full of different facts and different things that most people probably don't know about early policing from a Black perspective. So who was the first Black lawman that you all can recall knowing about in the course of your career?
Well, as far as that is concerned, Bass Reeves, he was the first U.S. Marshal, actually black marshal in the United States. This was back in the 1800s, and he was very well known about his business, had a lot of integrity, definitely one of the most notarized and professionals in regard to his job, and especially back then. Of course, then it was slavery time, and for him to come up and do the things that he did was remarkable. And there's a lot of history in regards to that. But Bass Reeves, and there's a lot of movies and things in regards to him. But he was one of the first known law enforcement officers in the United States.
And Bass Reeves worked out of the Oklahoma and Texas territories, and he was the emphasis for Hollywood to come up with the Lone Ranger. Once again, we were hoodwinked and bamboozled, but the Lone Ranger is actually based off of Bass Reeves.
Wow.
As far as I can go back and remember, the first police officers, black police officers, I know in Atlanta came about around 1948.
Mm-hmm.
And in the city of Atlanta, and I think the first group of officers they hired was about 7 or 8 of them. And it was on a segregated police department here in Atlanta where those officers couldn't arrest white people. They weren't allowed to carry weapons to protect themselves, and they even went so far as couldn't even, come into the police headquarters or precincts and change uniforms. They had to go down to the I can't remember
the
YMCA,
right.
in the Butler Street YMCA here in Atlanta. The first black police officer I can remember in D.C. was the chief told me he was hired in 1948,
Right.
and I didn't even know that there were black police officers then. And I remember speaking to my father, who went to high school in the 50s, and he said a lot of the black men that he knew that wanted to be police officers in Atlanta or the South would go to places like D.C. because they were hiring black police officers in the 40s and 50s before the southern cities were. So a lot of black men went to places like D.C. that gave them an opportunity to be police officers, even though D.C. was then considered still to be the South and was dealing with segregation.
Exactly. And as far as that's concerned, that was
Colonel Jefferson.
Jefferson. He was the first one of the first black law enforcement officers in the District of Columbia. And as a matter of fact, when I graduated from the academy, I had an opportunity to meet with him and talk with him in regards to that. And one of the things back then in the 1800s, when law enforcement was in D.C., Police Department actually had officers that worked at the Capitol, and that's where most officers also left and went to the Secret Service as well, because D.C. had the responsibility for all of that area at that point in time, when in the early 1800s, even up to the 1900s. But Bertrell Jefferson was one of the most well-known, and he became the first black chief of police in D.C.
Wow. That is amazing history. I thought I knew a lot about history when it comes to policing, but you guys are teaching me. Every time you guys open your mouth, I learn something new. And as a matter of fact, is the Civil Rights, I think it's the Civil Rights Museum here in Atlanta. There's a picture, I believe, of the first group of black officers that were hired, I think. And
Outside of Butler Street YMCA.
Yeah. So I remember actually seeing that picture. So it's interesting now that I'm talking to you guys about that history that actually that picture came from. So that's good stuff. So let's move a little bit forward. So just in the early days, you said in 1948, first black officers being hired. Based on things that you know, anecdotal things that you've heard from fellow police officers and older ones that you've met along your career, what was it like policing as a black man back then? No gun, maybe a billy club, maybe. Not being able to go into the, police precinct where everybody else was to change and just do the normal things that an officer would do. What was that atmosphere like?
Well, I think that one of the things that people really don't understand is that actually when law enforcement started in the United States, they were slave catchers. If we go back into history in regard with slavery. So law enforcement, and that's one of the reasons why there was such a disconnect within the black community. And to this day still is that disconnect. And one of the reasons that we're here is to try to come up with some suggestions and some reasons to help build that bridge that we have. The bridge is there, it just needs to be reconnected. And I think that one of the reasons that we're here is to let people know that we're not here to glorify law enforcement, but to also talk about some of the things in relation to law enforcement and how these things can get better. And also call out things that are wrong. If it's wrong, it's wrong. And regardless of where you are in law enforcement, the most important thing about it is having that connection with the community and understand the importance of that. And the other thing about that as well is that the community also has to reach out to us as well. The way things are currently now, and Craig and I both can attest to that, is that that disconnect can be rebuilt. And I think that's one of the ways of doing it. But when law enforcement actually started in the United States, it was slave catchers. So for law enforcement, for the ones in the DC that I know personally, they had to park the vehicles, they were cold, there were times when they didn't get any food or anything like that, but the community would take care of them. One of the things that they would say, we went into the black community and they would give us something to eat and keep us warm and so forth, and then of course when the patrol sergeant would come by and check on them, they'd be outside walking the beat, but they would know that they were being taken care of, and one of the most important things about it is how the community was there to help them at that point in time.
My uncle was hired by Metropolitan Police Department in DC, I think in 1958 or 59, and I still talk to some of the gentlemen that he worked with. A lot of them are in their mid 80s or even older, and they can still remember walking the footbeat, having to go to a call box, and the supervisor would call for the officers out on the street at night, working midnight shift, and they would tell me that the sergeant would come around and pick up all the white officers and take them to get them coffee or bring them coffee, and relieve them out on the street. As a matter of fact, Charles and I spoke to a 89-year-old DC police officer last week that was just explaining that to us. So they went through a lot of probably discriminatory practices, but they did what they had to do to get through, to be able to maintain their jobs and be like I would say a buffer or a vanguard in the black community. So it was a point in time in the African American community, after us having so much distrust for the police, because at one time, the only time we saw the police in our community over the years in America was when the police was coming in to arrest somebody or beat the brains out of somebody. So that was one of the reasons with the slave catchers and just the violence that we dealt with the police. And so that was the beginning of the distrust. But as the black men start coming on and black females start coming into law enforcement, at some point you saw that it started to change, And but there are a lot of older men and women out here that serve their communities admirably, and the situation that we're in now with the distrust in the community is going to have to, in my opinion, the only way it's going to be resolved is that the community and the police are going to have to work together.
Absolutely.
I completely 1,000% agree with you on that. And, you had mentioned something, Craig, in some past conversations that we've had, is that oftentimes the willingness of the community to work with law enforcement is often a vital piece of solving crimes in the community. Can you speak to that?
In Atlanta, I remember we used to call the drug dealers dope boys. In DC, they call them hustlers. And even the hustlers on the street, when one of their family members are killed or something happens to them, they want the police to make an arrest. And I think one of the worst things that happened in our community was this whole thing that came out of Baltimore, snitches get stitches. And that carried on and became pervasive in certain communities. But like I said, even the worst criminals in the street, when something happens to them, their families want their crimes to be solved and the police to do something about it. So, I can't name one community in America that doesn't have a police force or a security department. So we are a vital part of the criminal justice system in America. And as much as we might not like them, when we need them, they normally come.
And to coincide with what Craig is saying, one of the things that we have to understand and realize is that one of the most important things about the community is policing themselves. When I was growing up, if you were going down the street and you did something, Miss Johnson would see you or Mr. Smith would say something to you, and that was part of our culture. That's what we did. It was part of our village from our ancestors, and we've gotten so much away from that now. Everybody shuts their door, nobody wants to speak, and these young folks out here now, things that they used to do, now everybody's into video games and so on and so forth. And now, at one time, for me, when I first came out, you had to walk a beat. So you walk a beat and you get to meet people, you get to talk to people, and sort of mannerism. One of the things that Craig mentioned is that now people will come up to you, they feel comfortable in talking to you. Well, you know so-and-so is going on down the street, or there's a drug operation going on down the street. And based on the fact that it's in the Black community, that's what was so important for us, to have that relationship and be able to deal with these situations that we have within the Black community, understanding how we work together, and more so than anything else, being on the same sheet of music, and how important it is to now, instead of us not being in that connection about talking and communicating with each other, that's one of the reasons that crime is in the way that it is now. And, you know, understanding the importance of parenting and parenting your children, but also allowing law enforcement to be friends. At one time, hey, the police officers were friends.
Officer friendly.
Yeah, officer friendly. And I can remember that very well. And we had respect for the police officers at that time. And they were friendly, they would talk to us and so forth. And there was not that fear factor that we currently have now in today's society.
And I have to also say that a part of the communications with the community falls back on the police. And the police in any community is the most visible form of your government. The first thing you're going to see whenever any city you go in, more than likely representing that city will be the police. And people form an opinion on your city by the crime, their interactions with the police, and things like that. And one of the things I found over my career, there are going to be bad things that happen.
Absolutely.
And the police are going to do things that the public doesn't like. But if you're working with your community and you build relationships with them, there's a thing that I call a chest of goodwill. When something bad happens and it's on the news and everybody can see it, if I build relationships with people in that community, whether it's Miss Johnson that lives on whatever street, the coaches at the school, the high school, the kids in the community, if they trust me and have a relationship with me, whatever's going wrong, it may look bad, but they're going to give me the benefit of the doubt to make sure that I get it right. When you don't have a relationship with the community and something goes bad, if you look at the news, you'll see a police chief or a sheriff standing there by himself. He doesn't have a relationship with his community. And when something happens, when you've built a relationship with their community and they trust you, those people will come and stand with you and say, okay, we don't like what we saw happen in this community. And we're going to give you an opportunity to get it right. But you need the support of the community to be able to carry out your job and to do whatever mission you got set in front of.
Absolutely. And that's so important because, as Greg mentioned, when you find out and you see that on the news media, now it allows other people also to have this opportunity to say, hey, you know, the community is along with the police, although they may not look good at this point in time, but after further investigation, and we look and find out that this is what police did and they had to do what they had to do in regards to the situation, and to make the community safer for everyone.
You make some great points, man. And just a quick anecdotal story that I've experienced with police officers is I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood. There was a situation, I was a HOA president at one time. So naturally, people gonna call me if something goes wrong in the community, whatever. I was sort of the go-between. So I went over to this young lady's house. Turns out her 8-year-old son had some friends over to the house and somebody stole his PlayStation and just took it out of his house or whatever. So the police show up, white police officer shows up, and his whole approach was just, he kept saying, we can put some points on his juvenile record. Now this kid's 8. He's like, we can put some points on his juvenile record if you want. You know, no problem resolution, no explaining, no anything. And the little kid, he was upset. He was upset. Mom, they took my thing. And he kept on going, Mama, they took my thing. And the officer kept telling the young man, calm down now. Calm down, young man. Calm down. He's only 8 years old. Right. You know, he lost his PlayStation. I mean, to an 8-year-old, that's like, that's huge. That's major stuff, right? So I'm going to pose sort of a situation to you guys. And I want you to kind of answer it from the perspective that we're dealing with, right? So you pull up, you get some noise complaints from a group of young Black men in the front of the house or on the corner making some noise, whatever, drinking out of open containers, this and that kind of stuff. You get a call, you respond to the situation. You pull up on the scene, right? So white officer, Black officer, what, in your opinion, and based on your experience, is the difference in how that situation is resolved to where it does not escalate?
Yeah, sure.
I've actually had that particular call, disorderly people on the corner drinking. And what I found is a lot of white officers that have grown up in communities who were around black people, that went to school with them, interacted with and had black friends, they know how to approach that situation and address it similarly to the way I would. Example, I've gotten that call before. I've worked that neighborhood because I've been talking to people in that neighborhood. First thing I do, it may be a Friday evening. Those guys standing on the corner drinking that quarter beer, OE or whatever, been working all week, and they just standing outside of their house drinking. So instead of me pulling up, jumping out of my cruiser, telling everybody to get on the wall, and we start frisking them, first thing I say, hey man, y'all, come on man, I know y'all had a hard week. Look, could you please pour the beer into a cup so I don't have to come back around here? Oh, okay, officer, we appreciate that. So that builds a little credit with them for me, that I didn't just jump out and all of a sudden I'm making them into criminals. It's just a noise complaint. Hey man, could y'all keep it down because your neighbors are complaining? Okay, we got it. They appreciate that. Those may be the same guys when Charles or I become a homicide detective that will call us up and say, hey, this is what happened to Pookie in the neighborhood. Right. That's how you develop that chest of goodwill. An officer, black or white, that has no interaction or know how to move around in the hood. They're going to think that every time you come in contact with the community, you've got to do an enforcement. Right. And that's not always necessary. So, Charles, you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, and Craig's making a good point. I've had to do the same thing. You come up to the guys, and sometimes I would just walk up and say, hey, fellas, how y'all doing, man? Hi, officer, we doing well, man. And sometimes, if they see certain officers, it's automatic. They say, oh, man, you know what, we sorry, Officer Yarbrough, we apologize, man. I said, man, look, man, it's all good, man. Why don't y'all go and put that stuff in a brown paper bag? Oh, okay, officer, all right. You know, Miss So-and-so down the street, she see y'all, I see y'all, it's all good. And just have that communication with them and let them know that, hey, man, sometimes these guys have worked hard, they out here in the hot sun, whatever the case may be, they just chilling out, they ain't bothering nobody. And 9 times out of 10, they be say, okay, man, no problem. They go back in the house and it's all good. Or they'll put it in a brown paper bag and we have a conversation for 15 to 20 minutes. I'm gone and everything's good. And then on top of that, sometimes you even see some of the children out there. So now they're seeing that relationship between us and these brothers. And now that could be their father, that could be their uncle, that could be their grandfather, whatever the case may be. And that also helps build that rapport. And then the mother that may be looking out the window, or Miss Johnson who's looking down the street, so now she feels more comfortable. So those are some of the ways that community and that bridging now is gone. And unfortunately, that's what's going on currently now today in law enforcement, because there's so many calls for service. The lack of law enforcement, police officers actually that have that training and that understanding about community relations, where you get to talk to people and having that conversation, just standing out on the corner, people to come up to you sometimes and just have a conversation. So those are the type of things that when I was in law enforcement that helped me to be where I was and helped me to survive as well out on the streets.
And I think one of the key things about it, in the police department, your police department should reflect the community you serve.
Absolutely.
I agree with that.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And that means being diverse. And a part of being diverse on the police department is just a microcosm of the macro of a community. And we got everything on the police department that's in the neighborhood. We got black officers, white officers, Asian officers,
female.
We got male and female, we got straight officers, we got gay officers. The same thing you have in the community, and those should be reflected on your police department.
Yeah, and that's another reason that we're here, is also to let people know how important it is to look at law enforcement. At one time when I came on, and Craig can attest to this, it was a profession. They looked at it as a profession. Now it's just a job. It's a 9 to 5 where I get off at a certain time. It doesn't work like that in the real world. So if we go back to being a professional and look at it from that standpoint.
As a career.
As a career. And that's a big difference, because now you look at it totally different than when you did as going to a 9 to 5 job and I'm supposed to get off at a certain time and there's no connection with who I'm working with. I just get my paycheck and keep it moving. But now my paycheck is the relationship that I have with the community. And I think that that's what's most important.
Wow, good points, great points. And the diversity issues, meaning if an officer comes just on GP, if an officer looks like me, chances are I'm gonna feel a different way about him approaching me. Him or her, however they approach me, I'll feel a little bit differently than if they were a white officer, quite honestly. And and I'm being 100% transparent and honest here, and that comes from somewhere. That viewpoint of the public comes from somewhere. Where do you think that comes from? And I think you touched on it a little bit earlier. Where does that barrier come from? Meaning, I look at a white officer different than I look at a black officer, and that's for anybody, quite honestly. Where are the seeds of that? Where do you think that comes from?
That's from the history of America,
Exactly.
from slavery in this country, and the taskmaster. And as I mentioned earlier, for most black people growing up in the South, the slave catchers were the police. If you're moving from one location to another, I'm going to see my sister on another plantation, and I'm walking, to go there, and I get stopped by these guys out there that are slave catchers, and they're all white, and I better have some credentials to show where I'm at, or where I'm going. That may cause me to get beat down or even hung on a tree. So it's inherent in our community that our parents taught us, well, back in the 60s and 70s growing up, that, hey, respect the police, but also be careful around the police.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I don't know where the disconnect has come over the last few years with the police, but it's a thing that's inherent in our community, that the police, we don't trust them. And I'm going to give you a further example of that. We've had an influx of Latino Americans that come in this country in the last 30 or 40 years. Charles, and you might have heard this in D.C., when we first started getting the influx after that war down there with the Contras and the Sandinistas, right when crack hit in the United States, where police officers were told that a lot of those new immigrants wouldn't talk to the police because of the way they were treated by the police in their countries. Whether it was Mexico, El Salvador, Costa Rica, anywhere in Central America. So they wouldn't talk to the police. So when we were seeing them, it was the hardest thing to do was having a conversation with them, not just because they didn't speak English, but they had a deep trust of the police.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's part of the problem we're seeing with a lot of Latino communities and policing. You know what I mean? So it's not just because you're a white guy or you're a black guy. They just didn't trust the police.
Period.
Regardless of what type of uniform that you had. And that's an important part of it, in understanding how the bridge can be rebuilt, but it takes both parts in order to do so. But that distrust can be corrected. And the other thing about it is, and Craig mentioned it as well, is getting people that look like us to go into the community and so forth. I can recall when I was promoted to a sergeant, and I was in D.C. in the upper part of Georgetown, and it was a predominantly white neighborhood. At one time it was black. And there were times when officers would get calls for service, and I was talking to some of the black officers, and when they showed up at the door, they had to go around to the back.
Hold up.
Wait
a minute.
To the back. They couldn't go around to the front.
I'm a police officer in the city of Atlanta, 1988. I get a call in one of the prominent communities in Atlanta, Buckhead, right off of Peachtree Street, $1 million houses. I pull up to the ladies in front of the house, get out of my cruiser, walk up to the front door, ring the doorbell. Lady comes to the door, white female, and she says, "Officer, can you come around to the back door?" When she said that, I kind of looked. She closed the door. When she closed the door, told me to go around to the back door. You know what I did? I went and got on my cruiser and I left. And that to me, I was not going to anybody's back door. That was 1988. You know what I mean? And even had a situation downtown Atlanta. I get on the elevator for a call downtown for something that happened. I'm in my uniform, proud, get on the elevator with these females, and they just happen to be all white. I step on the elevator, they all grab their purses and back up. Like I'm, getting on the elevator to, rob them.
And you got on full uniform.
I'm in full uniform.
Wow.
So those are some of the things I guarantee you, if you talk to black police officers around this country, that they've had to deal with, that certain people think that because you're an officer of color, that you're not as good a police officer as a white officer. And that is bias, racism. And we dealt with that also.
And that's another thing too, Todd, that people really don't understand is that not only do we have to deal with that, but also policing our own people. We don't make the laws.
That's
We
correct.
have to enforce the laws. And understanding that there's certain things that just cannot be done. So having these conversations and talking about these things is important, and that's why the relationship between the community is so important, and understanding the importance of us working together to have a better understanding of how we can get along and get things done. And there are times when law enforcement shows up, we have to do certain things in order to make the community more safer. And Craig made a very good point where that if the police chief or the sheriff is standing there and the news media is there, and you have citizens standing there and say, we support the police, we're behind the police, that makes a big difference to everybody.
Even when they're wrong.
Even when they're wrong, exactly. Even when they're wrong. And sometimes that is true. And again, one of the reasons that we're here is we're not here to glorify law enforcement in that sense, but also talk about the things that are wrong that we see based on evidence and based on the things that we know based on facts, that sometimes law enforcement does things that they should not be doing, and the importance of dealing with that. There's three main factors in any job, especially in law enforcement. Recruiting is important. Training is of the utmost importance, and how you discipline people. If they're doing something wrong, they need to be disciplined. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. But when you start with the recruiting part of it, who's recruiting the police? And going back to what we talked about as far as being a professional, this is a career. Your career is to serve the public. When you raise your hand and swear in, that is it. It don't have nothing to do with what color you are. It's about dealing with the fact of what you're doing for that community. The training part of it is essential. You gotta make sure that people are trained properly. And you gotta be able to look people in the face and say, you're not good enough for us at this point in time. All right? We ain't going nowhere. Get yourself together and come on back. But we're still here. And then the discipline part. And that should be left up to the police chief and the citizens as well to have these community relations so that they can be a part of it as well in regards to things that they see as wrong as well.
And I think a big thing with everything we've seen in the United States over the last few years, let's look back. I think I was appalled when I saw the case in New York with Rodney Garner. He walked out of his apartment, and the first thing he's grabbed by police officers and he's put on a chokehold, which the NYPD had already came out and said, we don't teach that.
Right.
You know, but the problem I have with that, they killed that man, which they did. How do those guys keep their jobs? You know what I mean? Go back to walking in roll call on March 3rd, 1992, and I look up on the news and we all looking at Rodney King in LA. You know what I mean? That to me was unbelievable. And I remember there were older officers in my roll call that night that basically said, oh, he got what he deserved. And me and some brothers in there with younger officers, we were like, that was ridiculous. That was inhumane. All of them should be locked up. You know what I mean? And but I find a lot of times a lot of officers, especially young black officers, on a department where they may be a minority. A lot of times they will go out and do things that they know are wrong or witness things that they know are wrong to get along and to be accepted. And what they have to understand, that's not what you're there for. You have a duty to report something when you see something wrong. Same thing they tell the public. See something, say something. You have the same duty to do on the police department. That will get you fired and sent to jail. That's what happened in Minnesota when they were choking that brother to death up there. The rookie, who was the Asian officer, stood there while his partner had his foot or knee on a man's neck. He could have walked over at any time and said, hey man, okay, get him up. Let's put handcuffs on him. So what happens a lot of times, these young officers or officers on departments will get on a department and go along with things that they know are wrong in order to be accepted. One of the things I always felt was, you don't have to like me on the job, but you're going to respect me. And ain't nobody on this job worth me losing my job, you know, that I can't take care of my family. And somewhere along there, you got to draw a line on what you stand for as a police officer. You're either going to go along to get along, or you're going to do what you took an oath of office to serve the community, to uphold the Constitution of the United States, your community, or whatever. You know what I mean? And when you go home and lay down, your conscience is clear. Some of these guys see so many things that they're doing out there that's wrong, they have a seared conscience. It gets to the point where they've seen so much stuff over their career that nothing bothers them, and that's scary, and that's not good.
Wow, that is scary. Yeah, the just the fact that, and while you were talking, I was thinking about the popular media movies and stuff, and you see it in movies. Every movie now is about a dirty cop or something like, and it's almost like the media is glorifying what they should be putting down as far as a cop going against the grain and doing stuff he's not supposed to do or whatever. But then the guy who tries to come out and correct it and say this was wrong, this is what they did, he gets vilified. You know what I mean? So it's kind of happening all over the place, even in the popular media and things of that nature. But we got to have a part 2 to this, man. We just now really scratching the surface of this stuff, because there's a lot of subjects we want to get into in the future, like, policing within the police, what's it like being a black police officer in a mostly white unit? You know what I mean? What kind of things have you all had to deal with? Bringing that home, or trying to leave it in the street when you got to come home and be dad or be uncle or be husband. You know what I mean? What is all that stuff like? That's some stuff we're going to be talking about in future episodes, folks. But thank you very much, Charles and Craig, for opening this conversation up. It is sorely needed in our communities, and there are lots of solutions that we are going to talk about. You all spoke about some of them today, but I just want to thank you all for having the courage to step up and actually put this out there, because I guarantee you most people haven't really thought about this, in the course of their daily lives. Even if they do know black police officers, probably have not considered what it's like being a black police officer, which does mean a little bit different than just being a police officer. And we've touched on some of that today. So, folks, there you have it. Policing from a black man's perspective.